Hello all, I am Dr. Vasanthi, working as exercise physiologist at Center for Sports Science, Sri Ramchandra Institute of Higher Education and Research, Chennai. We are now looking at the topic Basics of Sports Physiology under the module Working within Sports Science Team. Under this topic, we are going to look at the following learning outcomes. To explain the scope of sports physiology, discuss the interplay of various energy systems during skeletal muscle contraction, describe the physiological changes due to exercise. So before commencing the topic, let us look at the various definitions. Exercise physiology is the study of how our body responds and adapts to physical stress, and sports physiology is an application of exercise physiological concepts to guide training and enhance sports performance. So basically, a sports physiologist will help the athletes to achieve his goal. The scope of responsibilities of an exercise physiologist: to promote health and wellness, to prevent illness and disability, to restore health, to help athletes to reach their potential in sports training as well as in performance. So having looked at the scope of an exercise physiologist, let's move on to the type of skeletal muscle fibers we have in our body. Broadly, the skeletal muscle fibers can be classified into two types. Type 1, which has a high aerobic endurance and can maintain exercise for prolonged periods. It also requires oxygen for the ATP production. Low intensity aerobic exercise and daily activities, this type of muscle fiber is involved in. It can efficiently produce ATP from fat and carbohydrates. So this is a kind of oxidative fiber, so which requires oxygen for ATP production. Type 2 skeletal muscle fibers in general have poor aerobic endurance and they fatigue quickly. They produce ATP anaerobically, and the type 2 fibers are again classified into type 2A and type 2X. Type 2A fibers, they can produce more amount of force, but they fatigue faster than the type 1 fibers. They are involved in short high intensity endurance events. Type 2X fibers are still more quicker in action, but they fatigue very easily. Type 2X fibers are involved in short explosive sprints. So now we are looking at the molecular basis of muscle contraction. We all know that the skeletal muscle contraction is produced by the sliding of the myofilaments like actin and myosin. One filament will slide over the other. So this results in the shortening of the skeletal muscle fiber. The steps in the contraction process are: first, when we think of any muscle activity, the thought process arises in the cerebral cortex. So from the cerebral cortex, the impulse is sent through the spinal cord to the respective muscle. So this is done by the motor nerve, and the junction between the motor nerve and the skeletal muscle fiber is called as neuromuscular junction. So as soon as the nerve impulse travel through the motor neuron, it reaches the neuromuscular junction. It releases a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. So this neurotransmitter will bind with its receptor on the muscle membrane. So this causes entry of few ions like sodium and potassium, and this results in the production of a local potential called end plate potential. This end plate potential, so when it is to a certain extent, will lead to the formation of action potential. So this is how the action potential in the nerve fiber travels to the muscle. So once it reaches the muscle membrane, so it has to spread through the inside of the muscle, so which is taken care of by the tubular system called as the sarcotubular system. So T-tubule carries the impulses down the muscle fiber. So it leads to the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this calcium will bind to the troponin C. This troponin C is going to pull up the tropomyosin, which is going to expose the active sites of actin. So once these active sites are exposed, myosin can easily bind to the actin and produce the necessary movement. So this is how the muscle contraction happens. So now we are looking at the process by which the skeletal muscle contraction is fueled. So how the skeletal muscle gets the energy for its contractile process. So there are three basic energy systems present in our body. namely the immediate energy system or the phosphocreatine system, the short-term energy system or the anaerobic glycolysis, the long-term system or the oxidative system. So each of this system are having a different characteristic. So the ATP phosphagen system can stay up to 30 seconds. Short-term energy system can stay up to the maximum of 3 to 5 minutes, and whereas the long-term system or the oxidative system can give us a sustained supply of energy. So we are looking at the duration for which these system last, as I told you. So the system which is said to decay very faster, okay, to fatigue faster is the ATP phosphagen system, followed by anaerobic glycolysis, which can give us energy up to 5 minutes, and the aerobic system, which can give us a continuous source of energy. So now let us look at the ATP phosphagen system. So it is an anaerobic system and it is a substrate level metabolism. So the ATP yield from this system is 1 mole of ATP can be generated from 1 mole of phosphocreatine, or also called as phosphagen. The duration, as I told you before, can last for 3 to 15 seconds. Because the ATP stores are very limited, this pathway is used to reassemble ATP. So as you can see in this picture, so the phosphocreatinine, when it breaks down to creatinine, phosphate and the free energy, this phosphate and the free energy can be diverted to adenosine diphosphate to produce ATP or adenosine triphosphate. So this is how this system is able to quickly generate ATP once there is a need. So the activities that rely most exclusively on this particular system are wrestling, apparatus routine in gymnastics, weightlifting, most field events, baseball and volleyball. This particular system can be assessed using a simple test called vertical jump test. We use an equipment called Vertec. So here we make the athlete to reach the maximum height he can, and the jump height is used to assess the peak power of the athlete. So the peak power is an indication of the capacity of this system. So now we are looking at the next system, anaerobic glycolysis. So this is an intermediary metabolism. So when we look at the metabolism of glucose, the aerobic metabolism of glucose, there are 3 essential steps, namely the glycolysis, the citric acid cycle or the TCA cycle, and then the electron transport chain. So these 3 steps are very essential for the oxidative metabolism to continue. So when the oxygen supply is not adequate, the body takes a shortcut. So where instead of going through all the 3 processes, so the pyruvate, which is the end product of glycolysis, gets converted to lactate. The hydrogen ions are accepted by the pyruvate, so to produce lactate. So this is how lactate is produced. The failure of the mitochondria to keep pace with the glycolysis, which is happening in the cytoplasm, produces the lactate. So the lactate which is formed is not useless. It can be used as a fuel. So the lactate, as soon as it is produced in the skeletal muscle, it is removed from the skeletal muscle, or we can say it is cleared from the skeletal muscle using the capillaries of the skeletal muscle. So the lactate reaches the liver through the capillaries, and in the liver the lactate is converted to glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. So the generation of glucose can be used in many ways. If we are continuing the workout, it can be used for the fuel of the muscle. If we have stopped doing the workout, we can convert it into glycogen and we can store it for the future purpose. So this whole process which happens between the skeletal muscle and the liver is called as Cori cycle. So next we are looking at the concept called lactate threshold. As I told you, when we start utilizing this anaerobic glycolysis, so we tend to accumulate lactate in the body. So it is a very slow process, and at one point of intensity, there is a significant accumulation of lactate. So this point is called as the lactate threshold. So lactate threshold is an indicator of our reliance on anaerobic metabolism. So later the lactate threshold, the better the performance. So this lactate threshold can be tested using a equipment called lactate meter. So as the athlete is doing the incremental test, we can prick them and get their capillary blood, and this blood can be used to assess their lactate values. The lactate which we get out of this testing can be plotted against the workload, and we can find out the workload at which the lactate is accumulating at a higher extent. So the next system we are looking at is the aerobic metabolism. So this is an oxidative system. So for this system to run, there should be adequate supply of oxygen. So the ATP yield from this system depends on the substrate we are utilizing. So it can be glucose or it can be free fatty acid. So from glucose, we get 32 to 33 molecules of ATP, whereas from the free fatty acid, we get around 100 molecules of ATP. It can steadily supply energy for hours together. So most of the long duration events are reliant on this aerobic metabolism. It is one of the most complex of the three bioenergetic systems, and it occurs in the mitochondria, unlike glycolysis, which exclusively happens in the cytoplasm. So now we are looking at the oxidative metabolism of carbohydrates and the fat. So carbohydrate, as I told you, it involves three steps, namely the glycolysis, which happens in the cytosol, and then the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle, which happens in the mitochondria, and in the inner layer of mitochondria, the electron transport chain happens. So at the end of this chain, so we get a considerable amount of ATP from it. So when we look at the oxidative metabolism of fat, so we can see the first step is called as the beta oxidation, and then the same citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle happens, followed by the electron transport chain. So what we are trying to understand here is the first step of both the metabolism is different, and the next two steps will be the same for carbohydrates and the fat. The aerobic metabolism can be assessed by a parameter called aerobic capacity, also called as the maximum volume of oxygen consumption. It is the highest rate of oxygen consumption achievable during a maximal exercise. So it is thought to be the best indicator of aerobic fitness or cardiorespiratory fitness. It is the upper limit to the production of energy via aerobic metabolism. So in this test, we can employ the incremental approach. We make the athlete to run at different speeds and elevation or different workloads. We assess the oxygen consumption at different workloads. When we see that the oxygen consumption does not increase with increase in the intensity, or when we see the plateau of the oxygen consumption, we call it as VO2 max. So this number is an indication of the aerobic capacity or the fitness of the aerobic metabolism. So in this particular picture, we are looking at many sports where the aerobic capacity is of the athletes are compared. So we can understand here some of the sports where the aerobic capacity is high is the cross country skiing and the cycling and long distance running. So these are the sports with high dependency on the aerobic metabolism. That is the reason the aerobic capacity is high here. So as a summary of the first and second objective, we are looking at this particular picture. So this is how the whole process of skeletal muscle contraction is fueled. So it can be from three energy system. As I told you, it can be ATP phosphagen system. So as soon as we use ATP for the muscle contraction, the same ATP can be regenerated using phosphocreatinine. So you can see the phosphocreatinine splits up and it gives the phosphate which can combine with ADP to form ATP. So this is the process. So this is the first system. The second system is the anaerobic glycolysis. When we don't have enough oxygen or the oxygen supply is not adequate, so the pyruvate can be converted to lactic acid. So this lactic acid through the capillary reaches the liver and it gets converted to glucose through gluconeogenesis, and the same glucose can be sent back to the working musculature. So this is the second system. The third system is the oxidative metabolism or the aerobic metabolism. We can use either fat or carbohydrates for this purpose. So the fatty acid can be converted to acetyl-CoA, and then it goes through the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain to liberate enough amount of ATP. So this is how the whole process of the skeletal muscle contraction is fueled. So please join back for the second part of the video on the various physiological changes due to exercise. Thank you.